Hello and welcome back to BookWaves. It is wonderful to continue this journey with you. We return now to Elizabeth Gaskell Cranford, and this time we are entering the very heart of the story's drama. This section covers the pivotal narrative of Chapter 12 to Chapter 14. We begin with a social scandal that sends shockwaves through the town's delicate hierarchy, pitting class against love in a most unexpected way. But that is nothing compared to the devastating news that follows a financial catastrophe that threatens to destroy the quiet, gentle life of our dear Miss Matty. How does a person of such profound integrity face ruin? And more importantly, how will the community of Cranford, in its finest hour, respond to one of its own in their greatest moment of need? This is a story of great misfortune, but also of even greater friendship. I look forward to reading your thoughts on these powerful chapters in the comments, and, as always, a preview of the grand finale is waiting for you in the description box below. Thank you for being here. Let us now witness this turning point in the life of Cranford. Chapter 12. The central question that occupied my thoughts was a persistent one. Was the man they called Poor Peter of Cranford one and the same as the Aga Jenkins of Chundrabadad? It was a puzzle I felt compelled to solve. At home, I was often criticized for my lack of discretion. It was my most prominent fault, a characteristic my friends and family never tired of pointing out. For once, I was determined to prove them all wrong. I resolved to become a model of prudence and wisdom. I would not so much as hint at my suspicions about the mysterious Aga. Instead, I would quietly collect evidence, bringing it home to present before my father, who was a trusted family friend to both of the Miss Jenkinses. This search for facts often brought to mind a story my father once told about presiding over a ladies' committee. He compared it to a passage in Dickens where a chorus is described as every man singing the tune he knew best, entirely to his own satisfaction. The charitable committee was much the same, with each lady pursuing her own preferred topic of conversation, much to her own contentment, but with little progress on the matter at hand. Even that committee, however, was nothing compared to the challenge of questioning the ladies of Cranford. I was attempting to gain some clear, definite information about poor Peter, such as his height, his appearance, and when he had last been seen or heard from. My efforts were met with a spectacular lack of focus. I remember one particular attempt during a visit to Mrs. Forrester's, where Miss Pole was also present. Since both ladies had known Peter, I thought they might help each other recall the details. I considered my timing quite opportune as I asked Miss Pole for the very last piece of news they had ever heard about him. Her answer was the absurd report I had heard before, that he had been elected the Great Lama of Tibet. This mention was a starting pistol for each lady to race off on her own train of thought. Mrs. Forrester immediately wondered if the veiled prophet in Lalla Rookh was meant to be the Great Lama. She added, though, that Peter had not been ugly, but rather handsome, despite his freckles. I was momentarily relieved that she had at least circled back to Peter. But in the next breath, she was lost in a lecture on the merits of Rowland's Calidor and other cosmetics. Her discourse was so fluent that I turned my attention back to Miss Pole. She had taken the mention of llamas, the beasts of burden, and somehow journeyed to the topic of Peruvian bonds and the share market. This led her to express her poor opinion of joint stock banks, particularly the one where Miss Matty's money was invested. I tried in vain to steer the conversation back. I interjected, asking in what specific year they had heard the news about Mr. Peter becoming the great Lama. But my question only served to unite them on a new, unrelated dispute. They began to argue whether llamas were carnivorous animals or not. The debate was hardly on fair grounds. After some back and forth, Mrs. Forrester sheepishly admitted that she always confused carnivorous with graminivorous, just as she did horizontal and perpendicular. She apologized quite sweetly, explaining that in her youth, the only real purpose of 4-syllable words was for spelling lessons. The only certain fact I had gained was that Peter had last been heard of in India, or at least somewhere in that vicinity. This scanty piece of intelligence had reached Cranford in a year marked by several memorable events. It was the year Miss Pole had brought her Indian muslin gown, an item long since worn out. We had washed it and mended it, tracing its decline and fall until it became a window blind before we could truly move on from its memory. It was also the year Wombwell's menagerie came to town. Miss Matty had specifically wanted to see an elephant, hoping it would help her better imagine Peter riding upon one. She had also seen a boa constrictor, which was far more than she wished to picture in her fancies of Peter's locality. Finally, it was the year Miss Jenkins had learned a piece of poetry by heart. At all the Cranford parties, she would declare that Peter was surveying mankind all the way from China to Peru. Everyone thought this sounded very grand. It also seemed rather appropriate because they reasoned that India was situated between China and Peru, provided one took care to turn the globe to the left instead of the right. I suppose all these inquiries of mine and the curiosity they stirred in my friends made us blind and deaf to what was truly going on around us. It seemed to me that the sun rose and shone on Cranford just as usual. The rain fell as it always did. I did not notice any sign of the times that could be seen as a premonition of some uncommon event. To the best of my belief, it was not only Miss Matty and Mr. Forrester who were caught unaware. Even Miss Pole herself, whom we looked upon as a kind of prophetess, was taken by surprise. She had a knack for foreseeing things before they came to pass, though she disliked disturbing her friends by sharing her foreknowledge. Yet even she was breathless with astonishment when she came to tell us the astounding piece of news. I must try to recover myself. The contemplation of it, even at this distance of time, still takes away my breath and my grammar. If I do not subdue my emotion, I fear my spelling will go too. We were sitting together, Miss Matty and I, much as we usually did. She was in the blue chintz easy chair with her back to the light, her knitting in her hand. I was reading aloud from the St. James's Chronicle. In just a few more minutes, we would have gone to make the small changes in dress that were customary before the usual time for calls at 12 o'clock. I remember the scene and the date perfectly. We had been talking about the signor's rapid recovery since the warmer weather had set in. We praised Mr. Hoggins' skill, while at the same time lamenting his lack of refinement and proper manners. It seems a curious coincidence that this should have been our subject, but so it was. Just then, a knock was heard at the door. It was a caller's knock, 3 distinct taps. We were in the midst of flying to our rooms to change our caps and collars. That is to say, Miss Matty could not move very fast, as she had a touch of rheumatism. Our escape was arrested by Miss Pole, who called out as she came up the stairs. She implored us not to go, insisting that she could not wait. She knew it was not yet 12, but she urged us to forget about our dress. She had something she absolutely had to tell us. We did our best to look as if we had not been the source of the hurried movement she had surely heard. Of course, we did not like anyone to suppose that we kept old clothes convenient for wearing out in what Miss Jenkins had once prettily called the sanctuary of home. So we threw a double force of gentility into our manners. We were very genteel indeed, for the 2 minutes it took Miss Pole to recover her breath. She excited our curiosity to a fever pitch by lifting her hands in sheer amazement and then bringing them down in silence. Her pantomime suggested that what she had to say was too enormous for words. Miss Pole finally let the words tumble out. She breathlessly asked Miss Matty what she could possibly think. The news, she stammered, was that Lady Glenmire was to marry. Or rather, she corrected herself, to be married. The intended husband was none other than Mr. Hoggins. Indeed, Mr. Hoggins was going to marry Lady Glenmire. The word marry seemed to hang in the air between us. It was an idea so shocking that we could only repeat it in disbelief, our shared sentiment quickly concluding that it was pure madness. Miss Pole nodded with the sharp decisiveness that was so much a part of her character. She confirmed that she had reacted in the very same way. She recounted how she had been in a public shop when she first heard of it. She had thought to herself what a fool her lady was going to make of herself. She confessed that she might have even said madness aloud, but had managed to control the impulse. She then lamented the state of the world, wondering where feminine delicacy had gone. She pointed out that both she and Miss Matty would have been utterly ashamed to learn that their own marriage prospects were being openly discussed in a grocer's shop in the hearing of the shopman. A sigh escaped Miss Matty, as if she were recovering from a physical blow. She voiced a sliver of hope that perhaps the story was not true. Perhaps, she suggested, they were doing Lady Glenmire an injustice. But Miss Pole quickly dismissed the possibility. She explained that she had already taken care to ascertain the facts. She had gone straight to Mrs. Fitzadam under the pretense of borrowing a cookery book. There, she had cleverly introduced her congratulations, commenting on the general difficulty gentlemen must have in housekeeping. Mrs. Fitzadam had bridled at this, and confirmed that the news was true, though she was mystified as to how or where Miss Pole could have heard it. Mrs. Fitzadam had said that her brother and Lady Glenmire had, at last, come to an understanding. Miss Pole repeated the word understanding with disgust, calling it a coarse term. She predicted that her lady would have to get used to many such wants of refinement. As proof, she added that she had reason to believe Mr. Hoggins supped on bread and cheese and beer every single night. Miss Matty uttered the word marry once more, her tone full of wonder. It was something she had never thought of. Two people they knew were going to be married. The event felt as if it were coming very near to them. Miss Pole agreed, adding dramatically that it was so near that her heart had stopped beating for the time it would take to count to 12. With a gentle pity in her voice, Miss Matty reflected that one never knew whose turn might be next. She mused that here in Cranford, Poor Lady Glenmire might have thought herself perfectly safe from such a thing. Miss Pole dismissed this with a toss of her head. She reminded us of the song about Tibby Fowler that poor dear Captain Brown used to sing. She paraphrased the lyric, whose meaning was that if you set a rich woman on a high hilltop, the wind itself would blow a man to her. I offered my own thought that the song's subject, Tibby Fowler, was rich. Miss Pole retorted that, in any case, there was a kind of attraction about Lady Glenmire that she, for one, would be ashamed to possess. I finally put in my own wonder, asking how Lady Glenmire could possibly have fancied Mr. Hoggins. I added that I was not at all surprised that Mr. Hoggins had taken a liking to her. Miss Matty considered this. She pointed out that Mr. Hoggins was rich, very pleasant-looking, good-tempered, and kind-hearted. Miss Pole offered her final theory on the matter. She concluded that Lady Glenmire had simply married for the sake of an establishment. With a little dry laugh at her own wit, she added that she supposed the surgery must have been included in the deal. But, like many who deliver a speech they believe to be both severe and clever, she began to relax her grimness after making this joke. Our speculation then turned to the inevitable question of how Mrs. Jamieson would receive the news. We contemplated the supreme irony of the situation. The very person Mrs. Jamieson had left in charge of her house, with strict orders to keep followers away from her maids, had managed to set up a follower of her own. And this follower was a man whom Mrs. Jamieson had expressly tabooed as vulgar. He was considered inadmissible to Cranford society. This was not merely on account of his name, but for a whole host of reasons. His voice was common, his complexion was coarse, and his boots perpetually smelled of the stable. He himself carried an odor of drugs. We wondered if he had ever actually been to see Lady Glenmire at Mrs. Jamieson's home. If he had, we suspected that in its owner's estimation, no amount of chloride of lime could ever purify the house again. Or perhaps their interviews had been confined to the chamber of the poor, sick conjurer. We had to allow, despite our collective sense of the unsuitable match, that both of them had been exceedingly kind to the man. Then it turned out there was a simpler explanation. A servant of Mrs. Jamieson's had been ill, and Mr. Hoggins had been attending her for some weeks. So the wolf had gotten into the fold, and now he was carrying off the shepherdess herself. What would Mrs. Jamieson say? We looked into the darkness of the future as a child gazes up at a rocket in a cloudy sky. We were full of wondering expectation, waiting for the rattle, the discharge, and the brilliant shower of light that was sure to follow. Then we brought ourselves back down to earth and the present time. We began questioning each other about the practical details, though we were all equally ignorant and had no data to build upon. When would this event take place? Where would it happen? How much money did Mr. Hoggins have a year? Would she drop her title? And how would Martha and all the other proper servants in Cranford ever be brought to announce a married couple as Lady Glenmire and Mr. Hoggins? The most pressing question, however, was a social one. Would they be visited? Would Mrs. Jamieson permit us to call on them? Or would we be forced to choose between the Honorable Mrs. Jamieson and the now degraded Lady Glenmire? We all liked Lady Glenmire the best. She was bright and kind, sociable and agreeable. Mrs. Jamieson, by contrast, was dull, inert, pompous, and tiresome. Yet we had acknowledged the sway of Mrs. Jameson for so long that it felt like a kind of disloyalty to even contemplate disobeying the prohibition we all anticipated. Just then, Mrs. Forrester surprised us, still in our donned caps and patched collars. We forgot all about our attire in our eagerness to see how she would bear the news. We honorably left the task of imparting it to Miss Pole. We could have taken unfair advantage and rushed in ourselves, for she was seized by a most out-of-place fit of coughing that lasted for 5 minutes after Mrs. Forrester entered. I shall never forget the imploring expression in her eyes as she looked at us over her pocket handkerchief. Her gaze spoke as plainly as words, pleading with us not to let nature deprive her of the treasure that was hers to share, even if she was temporarily unable to use it, and we did not. Mrs. Forrester's surprise was equal to our own. Her sense of injury, however, was rather greater. She had to feel for her entire social order, and she saw more fully than we could how such conduct brought stains upon the aristocracy. When she and Miss Pole finally left, we tried to subside into calmness, but Miss Matty was truly upset by the intelligence. She reckoned it up and realized it had been more than 15 years since she had heard of any acquaintance getting married, with the single exception of Miss Jessie Brown. The news, she confessed, gave her quite a shock. It made her feel as if she could not possibly imagine what might happen next. I have a notion, though I cannot say if it is a fancy of mine or a real fact. I have noticed that just after an engagement is announced, the unmarried ladies in that circle tend to flutter out in an unusual gaiety. They wear new dresses, as if to send a tacit and unconscious message to the world that they, also, are spinsters. Miss Matty and Miss Pole certainly talked and thought more about bonnets, gowns, caps, and shawls during the fortnight after Miss Pole's call than I had known them to do for years. It might, however, have simply been the spring weather. It was a warm and pleasant March, and our merinos and other woolen materials felt like ungracious containers for the bright, glancing rays of the sun. It certainly had not been Lady Glenmire's dress that had won Mr. Hoggins's heart. She went about on her errands of kindness looking more shabby than ever. Yet in the hurried glimpses I caught of her, she seemed to have a new glow. Although she appeared to shun meeting any of her friends, her face held almost something of the flush of youth. Her lips looked redder and more tremblingly full than they did in their old compressed state. Her eyes dwelt on all things with a lingering light, as if she was learning to love Cranford and everything in it. Mr. Hoggins, for his part, looked broad and radiant. He creaked up the middle aisle at church in a brand new pair of top boots. This was an audible, as well as visible, sign of his intended change of state. For tradition in the town held that the boots he had worn until now were the identical pair in which he first started his rounds in Cranford 25 years ago. They had, of course, been repaired more times than anyone could tell, with new pieces high and low, top and bottom, heel and sole, using both black and brown leather. None of the ladies in Cranford chose to sanction the marriage by congratulating either of them. We wished to ignore the whole affair until our liege lady, Mrs. Jameson, returned. Until she came back to give us our cue, we felt it would be better to consider the engagement in the same light as the Queen of Spain's legs. They were facts which certainly existed, but the less said about them, the better. This restraint on our tongues was beginning to feel irksome. You see, if we did not speak about it to any of the people involved, we could not get answers to the questions we longed to ask. Our idea of the dignity of silence was paling before our intense curiosity. Just then, our thoughts were given a new direction. An announcement was made by the principal shopkeeper of Cranford, a man who ranged his trades from grocer to milliner as occasion required. He declared that the spring fashions had arrived and would be exhibited the following Tuesday at his rooms on High Street. Now, Miss Matty had been waiting for this very event before buying herself a new silk gown. I had offered to send to Drumble for patterns, it is true. But she had rejected my proposal, gently implying that she had not forgotten her disappointment over the sea-green turban. I was thankful to be on the spot now, to counteract the dazzling fascination of any yellow or scarlet silk she might consider. I must say a word or two here about myself. I have spoken of my father's old friendship for the Jenkins family. Indeed, I am not sure if there was not some distant relationship between us. He had willingly allowed me to remain all winter at Cranford. This was in consideration of a letter Miss Matty had written to him around the time of the panic. I suspect she had greatly exaggerated my powers and my bravery as a defender of the house. But now that the days were longer and more cheerful, he was beginning to urge the necessity of my return. I only delayed out of a sort of odd, forlorn hope. I hoped that if I could obtain any clear information, I might make the account of the Aga Jenkins given by the Signora tally with what I had gathered about the man known as Poor Peter. I wanted to reconcile the stories of his appearance and his disappearance, which I had carefully winnowed out of conversations with Miss Pole and Mrs. Forrester. Chapter 13. On the very Tuesday morning that Mr. Johnson was going to show the fashions, the postwoman brought 2 letters to the house. I refer to her as the postwoman, but I should be more accurate and say she was the postman's wife. Her husband was a lame shoemaker, a very clean and honest man who was much respected in the town. He never brought the letters around himself, except on unusual occasions like Christmas Day or Good Friday. On those festive days, the letters that should have been delivered at 8 in the morning would not make their appearance until 2 or 3 in the afternoon. This was because everyone liked poor Thomas and always gave him a warm welcome. He used to explain, in his local dialect, that he was nearly stuffed from eating. He would say there were 3 or 4 houses where they would not be satisfied unless he shared in their breakfast. By the time he had finished his last breakfast, he would arrive at some other friend's house just as they were beginning dinner. But no matter what temptations he faced, Tom was always sober, civil, and smiling. As Miss Jenkins often remarked, he served as a lesson in patience for others. She felt sure his example would call out that precious quality in certain minds where it might have otherwise lain dormant and undiscovered. Patience, however, was certainly very dormant in Miss Jenkins's own mind. She was always expecting letters and would impatiently drum her fingers on the table until the postwoman had either called or gone past. On Christmas Day and Good Friday, she would drum from breakfast until church, and from church until 2 o'clock. The only interruption was when the fire needed stirring, at which point she would invariably knock down the fire irons and then scold Miss Matty for it. But just as certain as her impatience was the hearty welcome and the good dinner provided for Thomas, Miss Jenkins would stand over him like a bold dragoon, questioning him about his children. She wanted to know what they were doing and which school they attended. She would upbraid him if another child was likely to make an appearance. But despite her stern manner, she would send even the little babies the shilling and the mince pie that was her gift to all the children, adding half a crown for the father and mother as well. The arrival of the post was not nearly so important to dear Miss Matty, but not for the world would she have diminished Thomas's welcome or his customary gift. I could see that she felt rather shy over the whole ceremony, which Miss Jenkins regarded as a glorious opportunity for giving advice and benefiting her fellow creatures. Miss Matty would press the money all in a single lump into his hand, as if she were ashamed of herself. Miss Jenkins, in contrast, gave him each coin separately. She would offer a running commentary, indicating that one coin was for him, another for his daughter Jenny, and so on for the rest. Miss Matty would even beckon Martha out of the kitchen while he ate his food. Once, to my knowledge, she winked as she saw his meal rapidly disappear into a blue cotton pocket handkerchief. Miss Jenkins, however, would almost scold him if he did not leave a clean plate, no matter how heaped it had been, and she delivered an injunction with every single mouthful. I realize I have wandered a long way from the 2 letters that awaited us on the breakfast table that Tuesday morning. One was from my father, while Miss Matty's was a printed notice. My father's was a typical man's letter, which is to say it was very dull. It gave no information beyond the facts that he was well, that they had had a good deal of rain, and that trade was very stagnant. He also mentioned that there were many disagreeable rumors afloat. He then asked if I knew whether Miss Matty still retained her shares in the town and county bank, as there were very unpleasant reports circulating about it. This, he noted, was nothing more than he had always foreseen. He had prophesied this very outcome to Miss Jenkins years ago, when she insisted on investing their little property in it. He considered it the only unwise step that clever woman had ever taken to his knowledge, and I knew it was the only time she had ever acted against his advice. He concluded, however, that if anything had indeed gone wrong, I was of course not to think of leaving Miss Matty while I could be of any use to her and assist her in any way I could. Miss Matty then looked up and asked who my letter was from. She held up her own, explaining that it was a very civil invitation signed by an Edwin Wilson. The letter was asking her to attend an important meeting of the shareholders of the town and county bank. It was to be held in Drumble on Thursday, the 21st. She added that she was sure it was very attentive of them to remember her. I did not like the sound of this important meeting. Though I did not know much about business, I feared it confirmed what my father had written. However, I reasoned that ill news always comes fast enough, so I resolved to say nothing of my alarm. I merely told her that my father was well and that he sent his kind regards to her. She kept turning her letter over, admiring it. At last, she spoke again. She recalled that they had sent a similar letter to her sister, Deborah, some time ago. She had not been surprised then, because everyone knew Deborah was so clear-headed. She expressed her fear that she could not help them much. Indeed, if the discussion turned to accounts, she would be quite in the way, for she had never been able to do sums in her head. She knew that Deborah had rather wished to go, and had even gone so far as to order a new bonnet for the occasion, but when the time came, she was suffering from a bad cold. So instead, They had sent her a very polite account of what had been done. She thought they had chosen a director. She wondered aloud if they wanted her to help them choose a director now. She felt sure that if they did, she would choose my father at once. I gently reminded her that my father had no shares in the bank. She remembered then saying that he had objected very much to Deborah's buying any shares, but she affirmed that her sister was quite the woman of business and had always judged for herself. And, she pointed out as proof, the bank had paid 8% for all these years. This was a very uncomfortable subject for me. With my partial knowledge of the situation, I decided it was best to change the conversation. I asked her at what time she thought we should go to see the fashions. She explained her thinking on the matter. The proper etiquette, she said, was not to go until after 12 o'clock. But the problem was that, by then, all of Cranford would be there. One did not like to appear too curious about dresses and trimmings and caps with the entire world looking on. It was never considered genteel to be over-curious on these occasions. She recalled that Deborah had possessed the knack of always looking as if the latest fashion was nothing new to her, a manner she had caught from Lady Arley, who saw all the new modes in London. So, Miss Matty had devised a plan. They would just slip down early in the morning, using the need to buy half a pound of tea as a pretext. This would allow them to go upstairs and examine the new things at their leisure. They could see exactly how her new silk gown must be made. Then, after 12, they could go again with their minds disengaged and free from the practical thoughts of dress. We began to talk of Miss Matty's new silk gown. I soon discovered that it would be the first time in her life she had ever had to choose anything of consequence for herself. Her sister, Miss Jenkins, had always been the more decided character, whatever her own taste might have been. It is truly astonishing how such people carry the world before them by the mere force of will. Miss Matty anticipated the sight of the glossy folds with as much delight as if the 5 sovereigns set apart for the purchase could buy all the silks in the shop. I remembered my own experience, losing 2 hours in a toy shop before I could decide how to spend a silver 3p. Remembering this, I was very glad that we were going early, so that dear Miss Matty might have plenty of leisure for the delights of perplexity. If a happy shade of sea green could be met with, the gown was to be sea green. If not, she was inclined to a maize color, while I leaned toward silver gray. We discussed the requisite number of breadths all the way until we arrived at the shop door. Our plan was to first buy the tea, then select the silk, and finally clamber up the iron corkscrew stairs. These stairs led into what was once a loft, though it was now a fashion show room. The young men at Mr. Johnson's had on their best looks and their finest cravats. They pivoted themselves over the counter with a surprising activity. They wanted to show us upstairs at once. But on the principle of business first and pleasure afterwards, we stayed to purchase our tea. It was here that Miss Matty's absence of mind betrayed itself. If she was ever made aware that she had been drinking green tea, she always thought it her duty to lie awake for half the night. Consequently, green tea was prohibited in the house. Yet today, she herself asked for the obnoxious article, under the mistaken impression that she was talking about the silk. However, the mistake was soon rectified, and then the silks were unrolled in good truth. By this time, the shop was becoming quite well filled. It was Cranford Market Day, and many of the farmers and country people from the neighborhood had come in. They were sleeking down their hair and glancing shyly about from under their eyelids. They seemed anxious to take back some notion of the unusual gaiety to the mistress or the young women at home, yet they also felt out of place among the smart shopmen and the displays of gay shawls and summer prints. One man with an honest look, however, made his way up to the counter where we stood. He boldly asked to look at a shawl or two. The other country folk confined themselves to the grocery side of the shop, but our neighbor was evidently too full of some kind intention towards his mistress, wife, or daughter to be shy. It soon became a question in my mind whether he or Miss Matty would keep their shopmen occupied for the longest time. He thought each shawl he was shown was more beautiful than the last. And as for Miss Matty, she simply smiled and sighed over each fresh bale of silk that was brought out. One color set off another, and she remarked that the entire heap of them together would make even a rainbow look poor by comparison. Miss Matty hesitated, expressing a fear that whichever silk she chose, she would only wish she had taken another. Her eyes fell on a lovely crimson. She noted how warm it would be in winter, but then remembered that spring was on its way. With a slight drop in her voice, a habit we all had in Cranford, when talking about things we wished for but could not afford, she wished she could have a gown for every season. Then, recovering herself with a louder and more cheerful tone, she reasoned that it would give her a great deal of trouble to take care of so many gowns if she had them. Therefore, she thought, she would only take one. But which one, she asked me, must it be? And so she hovered over a lilac fabric with yellow spots, while I pulled out a quiet sage-green silk. It had faded into insignificance under the more brilliant colors, but it was nevertheless a good silk in its humble way. Just then, our attention was called off to our neighbor. He had chosen a shawl of about 30 shillings value. His face looked broadly happy, no doubt in anticipation of the pleasant surprise he would give to some Molly or Jenny at home. He had tugged a Leithreadern purse out of his breeches pocket and had offered a £5 note in payment for the shawl and for some parcels brought to him from the grocery counter. It was just at this point that he attracted our notice. The shopman was examining the note with a puzzled and doubtful air. The shopman then spoke, identifying the note as from the Town and County Bank. He told the man he was not sure, but he believed they had received a warning against notes issued by that very bank just that morning. He offered to step away and ask Mr. Johnson, but added that he was afraid he must trouble the customer for payment in cash or in a note from a different bank. I never saw a man's countenance fall so suddenly into dismay and bewilderment. The rapid change was almost piteous to see. The man struck his fist down on the table, as if to test which was harder. He exclaimed in frustration that the shopman talked as if notes and gold were simply to be had for the picking up. Miss Matty had completely forgotten her silk gown in her interest for the man. I do not think she had caught the name of the bank, and in my own nervous cowardice I was anxious that she should not. So I began admiring the lilac gown with yellow spots, a fabric I had been utterly condemning only a minute before, but it was of no use. Miss Matty asked what bank it was. She clarified her question, asking what bank his note belonged to. The stark answer came back. It was the Town and County Bank. She quietly asked the shopman to let her see it, She gently took the note out of his hand as he brought it back to return it to the farmer. Mr. Johnson, the shopman relayed, was very sorry, but from information he had received, the notes issued by that bank were little better than waste paper. Miss Matty turned to me and spoke in a low voice. She did not understand, she said. She asked if that was not their bank, the Town and County Bank. I confirmed that it was. I tried to create a diversion, holding up the folds of the lilac silk to catch the light. I remarked that I believed it would just match the ribbons in her new cap. All the while, I was wishing the man would make haste and be gone. And yet a new wonder had just sprung up in my mind, a question of how far it was wise or right for me to allow Miss Matty to make this expensive purchase. If the affairs of the bank were really as bad as the refusal of the note implied. But Miss Matty put on the soft, dignified manner that was so peculiar to her. It was a manner she rarely used, and yet which became her so well. Laying her hand gently on mine, she asked me to never mind the silks for a few minutes. Then she turned to the shopman who had been attending to the farmer. She did not understand him, she said, and then asked directly if the note was a forgery. The shopman assured her that it was not. It was a true note of its kind, he explained, but the issue was that it came from a joint stock bank. There were reports out that this bank was likely to break. Mr. Johnson, he added, was only doing his duty, a fact he was sure Mr. Dobson understood. But Mr. Dobson could not respond to the shopman's appealing bow with an answering smile. He was turning the note absently over in his fingers, looking gloomily at the parcel that contained the shawl he had chosen only moments before. He lamented that it was hard upon a poor man, one who earns every single farthing with the sweat of his brow. He sighed that there was no help for it. He told the shopman to take back the shawl, saying his wife, Lizzle, must go on with her old cloak for a while. He would still take the figs he had promised to the little ones, but the tobacco and the other things would have to be left behind. It was then that Miss Matty spoke to him. She offered to give him 5 sovereigns for his note. She explained her thinking that there must be some great mistake about the situation. She was one of the shareholders, she said, and she was sure they would have told her if things had not been going on right. The shopman whispered a word or two across the table to her. She looked at him with a dubious air. She conceded that perhaps the shopman was right, but she did not pretend to understand business. She only knew one thing. If the bank was going to fail, and if honest people were to lose their money because they had taken their notes, she trailed off. Suddenly becoming aware that she had gotten into a long sentence with 4 people for an audience, she then turned to the farmer and simply stated that she would rather exchange her gold for his note if he pleased. Then she told him he could take the shawl to his wife. She turned back to me and added that it was only a matter of going without her gown for a few days longer, after which she had no doubt everything would be cleared up. I could not help but ask what would happen if it was cleared up the wrong way. She replied that in that case, it would only have been common honesty for her, as a shareholder, to have given this good man the money. She was quite clear about it in her own mind, even if she could never speak as comprehensibly as others could. She asked Mr. Dobson to please give her his note and to go on with his purchases using her sovereigns. The man looked at her with silent gratitude, too awkward to put his thanks into words. He hung back for a minute or two, fumbling with his note. He said he was loath to make another person lose money instead of him, if it was indeed a loss. But, he explained, £5 was a great deal of money to a man with a family. And as she had said, there was a good chance that in a day or two the note would be as good as gold again. The shopman corrected this hopeful thought. "There was no hope of that, my friend," he said grimly. Miss Matty replied quietly that this was all the more reason why she should take it. She pushed her sovereigns towards the man, who slowly laid his note down in exchange. She thanked him. Then she informed the shopman that she would wait a day or two before purchasing any of the silks, as perhaps he would have a greater choice then. Turning to me, she asked if I would come upstairs. We inspected the fashions with as minute and curious an interest as if the gown to be made after them had already been bought. I could not see that the little event in the shop below had in the least damped Miss Matty's curiosity about the make of sleeves or the sit of skirts. She once or twice exchanged congratulations with me on our private and leisurely view of the bonnets and shawls. All the while, however, I was not so sure that our examination was so utterly private. I had caught glimpses of a figure dodging behind the cloaks and mantles. By a dexterous move, I came face to face with Miss Pole. She was also in her mourning costume, the principal feature of which was her being without her teeth, a deficiency she wore a veil to conceal. She had clearly come on the same errand as ourselves. But she quickly took her departure. She explained that she had a bad headache and did not feel herself up to conversation. As we came down through the shop, the civil Mr. Johnson was awaiting us. He had been informed of the exchange of the note for gold. With much good feeling and real kindness, but with a little want of tact, he wished to offer his condolences to Miss Matty. He wanted to impress upon her the true state of the case. I could only hope that he had heard an exaggerated rumor, for he told her that her shares were worse than nothing and that the bank could not pay a shilling in the pound. I was glad that Miss Matty seemed to remain a little incredulous, but I could not tell how much of this was real, or how much was an assumed self-control. It was a habit that seemed common to ladies of Miss Matty's standing in Cranford. They would have thought their dignity compromised by the slightest expression of surprise or dismay to an inferior in station or in a public shop. However, we walked home very silently. I am ashamed to say that I believe I was rather vexed and annoyed at Miss Matty's conduct in taking the note so decisively. I had so set my heart upon her having a new silk gown, which she wanted sadly. In general, she was so undecided that anyone might turn her round. In this case, I had felt that it was no use attempting it, but I was not the less put out at the result. Somehow, after 12 o'clock, we both acknowledged a sated curiosity about the fashions. We felt a certain fatigue of the body, which was, in fact, a depression of the mind. It indisposed us to go out again. But still, we never spoke of the note. Then, all at once, something possessed me to ask Miss Matty a question. I asked if she would think it her duty to offer sovereigns for all the notes of the town and county bank she might encounter. I could have bitten my tongue out the minute I had said it. She looked up rather sadly, as if I had thrown a new perplexity into her already distressed mind. For a minute or two, she did not speak. Then she began, "My own dear Miss Matty," without a shade of reproach in her voice. She explained that she never felt as if her mind was what people would call very strong. It was often hard enough work for her, she said, to settle what she ought to do with the case right in front of her. She was very thankful that she had seen her duty that morning, with the poor man standing by her, but it was a strain upon her to keep thinking and thinking what she should do if such and such a thing happened. She believed she would rather wait and see what really does come. She had no doubt that she would be helped then, if she did not fidget herself and get too anxious beforehand. She finished by reminding me, lovingly, that she was not like Deborah. If Deborah had lived, she had no doubt she would have seen to their affairs before they had ever gotten into such a state. Neither of us had much appetite for dinner, though we tried to talk cheerfully about indifferent things. When we returned to the drawing room, Miss Matty unlocked her desk and began to look over her account books. I was so penitent for what I had said in the morning that I did not presume I could assist her. I rather left her alone, watching as her eye, under a puzzled brow, followed her pen up and down the ruled page. After some time, she shut the book, locked the desk, and came to draw a chair next to mine, where I sat in moody sorrow over the fire. I stole my hand into hers. She clasped it, but did not speak a word. At last, with forced composure in her voice, she stated the precise figures. If that bank went wrong, she would lose £149, 13 shillings and 4 pence a year. She would only have £13 a year left. I squeezed her hand hard and tight. I did not know what to say. Presently, though it was too dark to see her face, I felt her fingers work convulsively in my grasp. I knew she was going to speak again. I could hear the sobs in her voice as she expressed her hope that it was not wrong or wicked. But oh, she was so glad that poor Deborah was spared this. She knew her sister, with her noble and lofty spirit, could not have borne to come down in the world. This was all she said about the sister who had insisted upon investing their little property in that unlucky bank. We were later in lighting the candle than usual that night. Until that light shamed us into speaking, we sat together very silently and sadly. However, we took to our work after tea with a kind of forced cheerfulness, which soon became real as far as it went. We talked of that never-ending wonder, Lady Glenmire's engagement. Miss Matty was almost coming around to think it a good thing. She began by saying she did not mean to deny that men are troublesome in a house. She was not judging from her own experience, for her father was neatness itself and wiped his shoes as carefully as any woman. But still, she reflected, a man has a sort of knowledge of what should be done in difficulties. It is very pleasant to have someone at hand, ready to lean upon. She now saw that Lady Glenmire, instead of being tossed about and wondering where to settle, would be certain of a home among pleasant and kind people, like our good Miss Pole and Mrs. Forrester. She added that Mr. Hoggins was really a very personable man. And as for his manners, if they were not very polished, she had known people with very good hearts and clever minds who were not what some might reckon refined, but who were both true and tender. She fell off into a soft reverie about Mr. Holbrook, and I did not interrupt her. I was too busy maturing a plan I had had in my mind for some days, a plan which this threatened failure of the bank had brought to a crisis. That night, after Miss Matty went to bed, I treacherously lit the candle again. I sat down in the drawing room to compose a letter to the Aga Jenkins. It was a letter that should affect him if he were Peter, and yet seem a mere statement of dry facts if he were a stranger. The church clock pealed out 2 before I had done. The next morning news came, both official and otherwise. The town and county bank had stopped payment. Miss Matty was ruined. She tried to speak quietly to me, but when she came to the actual fact that she would have but about 5 shillings a week to live upon, she could not restrain a few tears. She wiped them away, explaining that she was not crying for herself. She believed she was crying for the very silly thought of how her mother would grieve if she could know, for her mother had always cared for them so much more than for herself. But she insisted that many a poor person has less, and that she was not very extravagant. She thanked God that once the neck of mutton, Martha's wages, and the rent were paid, she did not have a single farthing owing. Her thoughts then turned to poor Martha, who she thought would be sorry to leave her. Miss Matty smiled at me through her tears, and she would have had me see only the smile, not the tears. Chapter 14. It was an example to me, and I fancy it might be to many others, to see how immediately Miss Matty set about the retrenchment she knew to be right. She accepted her altered circumstances and acted at once. While she went downstairs to speak to Martha and break the sad intelligence to her, I stole out with my letter to the Aga Jenkins. I went to the signor's lodgings to obtain the exact address. I bound the signora to secrecy. Indeed, her military manners had a degree of shortness and reserve in them which made her always say as little as possible, except when under the pressure of strong excitement. Moreover, my secret was made doubly sure by another fact. The signor was now so far recovered that he was looking forward to traveling and conjuring again. In just a few days, he, his wife, and little Phoebe would leave Cranford. Indeed, I found him looking over a great black and red placard. The poster set forth the Signor Brunoni's many accomplishments, and only the name of the town where he would next display them was wanting. He and his wife were so absorbed in deciding where the red letters would come in with the most effect that it was some time before I could ask my question in private. I first had to give several decisions on the important subject of the poster, which I then questioned with equal sincerity as soon as the signor threw in his own doubts and reasons. At last, I got the address. It was spelled out by sound, and it looked very queer. I dropped it in the post on my way home. Then, for a minute, I stood looking at the wooden pane with its gaping slit. The slot divided me from the letter that had been in my hand just a moment ago. It was gone from me like life, never to be recalled. I imagined its journey. It would get tossed about on the sea, stained perhaps with sea waves. It would be carried among palm trees and scented with all the tropical fragrances. The little piece of paper, so familiar and commonplace only an hour ago, had now set out on its race to the strange wild countries beyond the Ganges. But I could not afford to lose much time on this speculation. I hastened home, so that Miss Matty might not miss me. Martha opened the door for me, her face swollen with crying. As soon as she saw me, she burst out afresh. She took hold of my arm, pulled me in, and banged the door shut. She needed to ask me if it was all true, everything that Miss Matty had been saying. Martha declared that she would never leave her mistress. She stated firmly that she would not. She had already told Miss Matty so, and she could not understand how her mistress could find it in her heart to give her warning. She felt she could not have had the face to do such a thing if she had been in Miss Matty's place. She suggested that she might have been just as good for nothing as Mrs. Fitz, Adam's servant, Rosie, who had struck for wages after living 7.5 years in one place. Martha said she was not one to go and serve Mammon at that rate. She knew when she had a good mistress, even if her mistress did not know when she had a good servant. I tried to cut in gently as she wiped her eyes, beginning with a word of interruption. She immediately replied to my soft tone, telling me not to interrupt her in such a manner. I tried again, pleading with her to listen to reason. She would not listen to reason, she said, her voice now in full possession after having been choked with sobs. Reason, she declared, always meant what someone else had to say. She thought what she had to say was good enough reason. But whether it was reason or not, she was going to say it, and she would stick to it. She had money in the savings bank and a good stock of clothes, and she was not going to leave Miss Matty. No, not if she was given warning every hour of the day. She put her arms akimbo, as if to say she defied me. And indeed, I could hardly tell how to begin to remonstrate with her. I felt so strongly that Miss Matty, in her increasing infirmity, truly needed the attendance of this kind and faithful woman. At last, I simply began with a conciliatory opening. Martha seemed pleased. She was thankful that I had begun with a conciliatory opening. If I had begun with a word of protest, as I did before, she would not have listened. Now, she said, I might go on. I acknowledged that I knew she would be a great loss to Miss Matty. Martha broke in triumphantly, exclaiming that she had told her so. It would be a loss she would never cease to be sorry for. I continued, explaining that still, Miss Matty would have so little to live upon, so very little, that I did not see how she could possibly find food for Martha. She would even be pressed for her own. I told Martha this because I felt she was like a friend to dear Miss Matty, but I knew her mistress might not like to have it spoken about. Apparently, this was an even blacker view of the subject than Miss Matty had presented to her. Martha just sat down on the first chair that came to hand and cried out loud. We had been standing in the kitchen until that moment. At last, she put her apron down. Looking me earnestly in the face, she asked if that was the reason Miss Matty would not order a pudding that day. She recalled that her mistress had said she had no great fancy for sweet things, and that we would just have a mutton chop, but Martha declared that she would be up to her. She made me promise never to tell, but she would make her a pudding, and a pudding she would like too. She would pay for it herself. So, she insisted, I must see that she eats it. She added her belief that many a person has been comforted in their sorrow by seeing a good dish come upon the table. I was rather glad that Martha's energy had taken the immediate and practical direction of pudding making. It staved off the quarrelsome discussion as to whether she should or should not leave Miss Matty's service. She began to tie on a clean apron and otherwise prepare herself for going to the shop for the butter, eggs, and whatever else she might require. She would not use a scrap of the articles already in the house for her cookery. Instead, she went to an old teapot where her private store of money was deposited and took out what she wanted. I found Miss Matty very quiet and not a little sad, But after a little while, she tried to smile for my sake. It was settled that I was to write to my father and ask him to come over to hold a consultation. As soon as this letter was dispatched, we began to talk over future plans. Miss Matty's idea was to take a single room. She would retain as much of her furniture as would be necessary to furnish it and sell the rest. There, she would quietly exist upon whatever remained after paying the rent. For my part, I was more ambitious and less contented. I thought of all the things by which a woman, past middle age, and with the education common to ladies 50 years ago, could earn or add to a living without materially losing her social standing. But at length, I put even this last consideration on one side and simply wondered what in the world Miss Matty could do. Teaching was, of course, the first thing that suggested itself. If Miss Matty could teach children anything, it would throw her among the little elves in whom her soul delighted. I ran over her accomplishments in my mind. Once upon a time I had heard her say she could play a certain French nursery rhyme on the piano, the one whose melody is known in English as Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, but that was long ago. That faint shadow of a musical acquirement had died out years before. She had also once been able to trace out patterns very nicely for muslin embroidery. She did this by placing a piece of silver paper over the design and holding both against the window pane while she marked the scallops and eyelet holes. But that was her nearest approach to the accomplishment of drawing, and I did not think it would go very far. Then again, there were the branches of a solid English education, such as fancy work and the use of the globes, which the local ladies' seminary professed to teach. Miss Matty's eyes were failing her, and I doubted if she could discover the number of threads in a worsted work pattern, or rightly appreciate the different shades required for Queen Adelaide's face in the loyal wool work now fashionable in Cranford. As for the use of the globes, I had never been able to find it out myself, so perhaps I was not a good judge of her capability. But it struck me that equators and tropics and other such mystical circles were very imaginary lines indeed to her. I believed she looked upon the signs of the zodiac as so many remnants of the black art. The arts she truly prided herself upon, and in which she excelled, were making candle-lighters or spills, as she preferred to call them. These were made of colored paper, cut to resemble feathers. She also excelled at knitting garters in a variety of dainty stitches. I had once said, on receiving a present of an elaborate pear, that I should feel quite tempted to drop one in the street simply to have it admired. I found this little joke was a great distress to her sense of propriety. She took it with such anxious, earnest alarm, lest the temptation might some day prove too strong for me, that I quite regretted having ventured upon it. A present of these delicately wrought garters, a bunch of gay spills, or a set of cards on which sewing silk was wound in a mystical manner, were the well-known tokens of Miss Matty's favor. But would anyone actually pay to have their children taught these arts? Or indeed, would Miss Matty sell, for filthy lucre, the knack and skill with which she made these trifles, things made valuable only to those who loved her? I had to come down to reading, writing, and arithmetic. In her reading, she always coughed before coming to long words. I doubted her power of getting through a genealogical chapter, even with any number of coughs. Her writing was done well and delicately, but her spelling was another matter entirely. She seemed to think that the more unusual her spelling was, and the more trouble it cost her, the greater the compliment she paid to her correspondent. Words that she would spell quite correctly in letters to me became perfect enigmas when she wrote to my father. No, there was nothing she could teach to the rising generation of Cranford. The only exception would be if they were quick learners and ready imitators of her own virtues, such as her patience, her humility, her sweetness, and her quiet contentment with all that she could not do. I pondered and pondered this until dinner was announced by Martha, whose face was all blubbered and swollen from crying. Miss Matty had a few little peculiarities which Martha was apt to regard as whims below her attention. She appeared to consider them childish fancies that an old lady of 58 should try to cure herself of. But today, everything was attended to with the most careful regard. The bread was cut to the imaginary pattern of excellence that existed in Miss Matty's mind, which was the way her mother had preferred. The curtain was drawn so as to exclude the dead brick wall of a neighbor's stable, and yet left open just enough to show every tender leaf of the poplar, which was bursting into spring beauty. Martha's tone to Miss Matty was just such as that good, rough-spoken servant usually kept sacred for little children. I had never heard her use it to any grown-up person before. I had forgotten to tell Miss Matty about the pudding, and I was afraid she might not do justice to it, for she evidently had very little appetite that day. So I seized the opportunity of letting her into the secret while Martha took away the meat. Miss Matty's eyes filled with tears, and she could not speak, either to express surprise or delight, when Martha returned bearing it aloft. It was made in the most wonderful representation of a lion lying down with its head raised that was ever molded. Martha's face gleamed with triumph as she set it down before Miss Matty with an exultant exclamation. Miss Matty wanted to speak her thanks, but could not. So she took Martha's hand and shook it warmly, which in turn set Martha off crying, and I myself could hardly keep the necessary composure. Martha burst out of the room, and Miss Matty had to clear her voice once or twice before she could speak. At last, she said that she should like to keep this pudding under a glass shade. The notion of the lion, with his currant eyes, being hoisted up to the place of honor on a mantelpiece, tickled my hysterical fancy. I began to laugh, which rather surprised Miss Matty. She then remarked that she was sure she had seen uglier things under a glass shade before now. So had I, many a time, and I accordingly composed my countenance, though now I could hardly keep from crying. We both fell to upon the pudding, which was indeed excellent. Only every morsel seemed to choke us, our hearts were so full. We had too much to think about to talk much that afternoon. It passed over very tranquilly, but when the tea-urn was brought in, a new thought came into my head. Why should not Miss Matty sell tea? She could be an agent for the East India Tea Company, which then existed. I could see no objections to this plan, while the advantages were many. This was always supposing that Miss Matty could get over the degradation of condescending to anything like trade. Tea was neither greasy nor sticky, and grease and stickiness were two of the qualities which Miss Matty could not endure. No shop window would be required. A small, genteel notification of her being licensed to sell tea would, it is true, be necessary, but I hoped that it could be placed where no one would see it. Neither was tea a heavy article, so as to tax Miss Matty's fragile strength. The only thing against my plan was the buying and selling that would be involved. While I was giving but absent answers to the questions Miss Matty was putting, almost as absently herself, we heard a clumping sound on the stairs. This was followed by a whispering outside the door, which indeed once opened and shut, as if by some invisible agency. After a little while, Martha came in. She was dragging after her a great tall young man who was all crimson with shyness and found his only relief in perpetually sleeking down his hair. Martha began the introduction, explaining that he was only Jem Hearn. She was so out of breath that I imagined she had had some bodily struggle before she could overcome his reluctance to be presented in the courtly scene of Miss Matilda Jenkins's drawing room. Then Martha continued breathlessly that Jem wanted to marry her immediately. She added that they wanted to take a lodger, just one quiet lodger, to make their two ends meet. They would take any house that was suitable. Then, addressing Miss Matty directly, she asked, with as much boldness as she could muster, if her mistress would have any objections to lodging with them. She insisted that Jem wanted it as much as she did. Turning to Jem, she called him a great oaf and asked why he could not back her up. But she quickly added that he did want it all the same, very badly. She tried to excuse his silence by explaining that he was just dazed at being called on to speak before quality folk. Jem broke in, insisting that was not it. He explained that she had taken him all on a sudden, and that he had not thought to get married so soon. Such quick words, he said, could flabbergast a man. He then addressed Miss Matty, clarifying that it was not that he was against the marriage. It was only that Martha had such quick ways with her when she took a thing into her head. Marriage, he mused, rather nails a man down, as one might say, but he dared say he would not mind it after it was once over. Martha, who had been plucking at his sleeve and nudging him with her elbow to interrupt him, pleaded with Miss Matty not to mind him. She assured her that he would come to his senses. She explained that it was only last night that he had been asking her repeatedly to marry him, all the more because she had said she could not think of it for years to come. She claimed he was only taken aback now with the suddenness of the joy. Then, with another great nudge, she reminded Jem that he was just as keen as she was about wanting a lodger. Jem agreed, but with a want of tact that I could see enraged Martha. He would only want a lodger if Miss Matty would lodge with them. Otherwise, he had no mind to be cumbered with strange folk in the house. Martha had been trying to represent a lodger as the great object they wished to obtain, and that Miss Matty would actually be conferring a favor on them by coming to live with them. Miss Matty herself was bewildered by the pair. Their, or rather Martha's, sudden resolution in favor of matrimony had staggered her. It stood between her and the contemplation of the plan which Martha had at heart. Miss Matty simply began by stating that marriage is a very solemn thing. Jem quickly agreed that it was indeed, adding that he had no objections to Martha. Martha's face turned fiery red, and she was ready to cry with vexation. She accused him of never leaving her alone, always asking her to fix a date for their wedding, and now he was shaming her before her mistress and everyone. Jem tried to placate her, pleading with her not to cry, and explaining that a man just likes to have some breathing time. He tried to take her hand, but in vain. Then, seeing that she was more seriously hurt than he had imagined, he seemed to try to rally his scattered faculties. With more straightforward dignity than I would have thought possible for him just 10 minutes before, he turned to Miss Matty. He said he hoped she knew that he was bound to respect everyone who had been kind to Martha. He had always looked on her as his future wife. He added that she had often and often spoken of Miss Matty as the kindest lady that ever was. And while the plain truth was that he would not like to be troubled with common lodgers, if Miss Matty would honor them by living with them, he was sure Martha would do her best to make her comfortable. He promised he would keep out of her way as much as he could, which he reckoned would be the best kindness an awkward fellow like him could offer. Miss Matty had been very busy, taking off her spectacles, wiping them, and replacing them. All she could say was a plea that they should not let any thought of her hurry them into marriage. She prayed that they would not, adding that marriage is a very solemn thing. I spoke up then, struck with the advantages that the plan offered and unwilling to lose the opportunity to consider it. I assured Martha that Miss Matilda would think of her plan. I added that I was sure neither she nor I could ever forget her kindness, nor Jem's either. Jem replied that he was sure he meant kindly, though he was a bit fluttered by being pushed so straight ahead into matrimony. He admitted that he might not be expressing himself properly. But he was sure he was willing enough, if they would just give him time to get accustomed to the idea. Then, in a low voice, he asked Martha what the use was of crying so and of slapping him if he came near. This last comment was spoken very quietly and had the effect of making Martha bounce out of the room, to be followed and soothed by her lover. Whereupon Miss Matty sat down and cried very heartily. She accounted for it by saying that the thought of Martha being married so soon gave her quite a shock. She felt she should never forgive herself if she was the one hurrying the poor creature. I think my pity was more for Jem, of the two. But both Miss Matty and I appreciated to the full the kindness of the honest couple, although we said little about this, and a good deal about the chances and dangers of matrimony. The next morning, very early, I received a note from Miss Pole. It was so mysteriously wrapped up and with so many seals on it to secure secrecy that I had to tear the paper before I could unfold it. When I came to the writing, I could hardly understand the meaning. It was so involved and oracular. I made out, however, that I was to go to Miss Pole's at 11 o'clock. The number 11 was written out in full length as well as in numerals, and the letters A.M. were twice dashed under, as if I were very likely to come at 11 at night, when all Cranford was usually in bed by 10. There was no signature except Miss Pole's initials reversed, P.E. But as Martha had given me the note with Miss Pole's kind regards, it needed no wizard to find out who had sent it. And if the writer's name was to be kept secret, it was very well that I was alone when Martha delivered it. I went as requested to Miss Pole's. The door was opened to me by her little maid Lizzie, who was in her Sunday trim, as if some grand event was impending over this workday. The drawing-room upstairs was arranged in accordance with this idea. The table was set out with the best green card cloth and writing materials. On the little chiffonier was a tray with a newly decanted bottle of cowslip wine and some ladies' finger biscuits. Miss Pole herself was in solemn array, as if to receive visitors, although it was only 11 in the morning. Mrs. Forrester was there, crying quietly and sadly. My arrival seemed only to call forth fresh tears. Before we had finished our greetings, which were performed with a lugubrious mystery of demeanor, there was another sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Fitzadam appeared, crimson with walking and excitement. It seemed as if this was all the company expected. For now Miss Pole made several demonstrations of being about to open the business of the meeting. She stirred the fire, opened and shut the door, and coughed and blew her nose. Then she arranged us all around the table, taking care to place me opposite to her. Last of all, she inquired of me if the sad report was true, as she feared it was, that Miss Matty had lost all her fortune. Of course, I had but one answer to make, and I never saw more unaffected sorrow depicted on any countenances than I did there on the three faces before me. At last, Mrs. Forrester spoke, expressing a wish that Mrs. Jameson was there. But to judge from Mrs. Fitzadam's face, she could not second that wish. Miss Pole then spoke, with just a sound of offended merit in her voice. She insisted that even without Mrs. Jameson, they, the ladies of Cranford assembled in her drawing room, could resolve upon something. She imagined that none of them were what might be called rich. However, she stated, they all possessed a genteel competency, sufficient for tastes that were elegant and refined, and they would not be vulgarly ostentatious, even if they could. At this point I observed her refer to a small card concealed in her hand, on which I imagined she had put down a few notes. She continued addressing me formally as Miss Smith, though I was familiarly known as Mary to all the company. She explained that this was a state occasion. She had conversed in private with these ladies on the previous afternoon, making it her business to do so. They had discussed the misfortune which had happened to our friend. One and all of them had agreed that while they had a superfluity, it was not only a duty, but a pleasure, a true pleasure. Her voice was rather choked just here, and she had to wipe her spectacles before she could go on. The pleasure, she said, was to give what they could to assist her, Miss Matilda Jenkins. Only, in consideration of the feelings of delicate independence existing in the mind of every refined female, they wished to contribute their mites in a secret and concealed manner. This was so as not to hurt the feelings she had referred to. I was sure she had gotten back to reading from the card now. She said their object in requesting me to meet them this morning was based on their belief that my father was Miss Matty's confidential advisor in all financial matters. They imagined that by consulting with him, I might devise some mode in which their contribution could be made to appear as a legal due which Miss Matilda Jenkins ought to receive from some source. She suggested that my father, knowing her investments, could probably fill up the blank. Miss Pole concluded her address and looked round for approval and agreement. She asked the other ladies if she had not expressed their meaning, and while I considered what reply to make, she invited me to take some little refreshment. I had no great reply to make. My heart held more thankfulness for their kind thoughts than I cared to put into words. So I only mumbled out something to the effect that I would name what Miss Pole had said to my father, and that if anything could be arranged for dear Miss Matty. Here I broke down utterly. I had to be refreshed with a glass of cowslip wine before I could check the crying which had been repressed for the last 2 or 3 days. The worst part was, all the ladies cried in concert. Even Miss Pole cried, though she had said 100 times that to betray emotion was a sign of weakness and a want of self-control. She recovered herself into a slight degree of impatient anger directed against me for having set them all off. Moreover, I think she was vexed that I could not make a speech in return for hers. If I had known beforehand what was to be said and had a card on which to express my probable feelings, I would have tried to gratify her. As it was, Mrs. Forrester was the person to speak when we had recovered our composure. She said she did not mind stating among friends that she was not exactly poor, but she did not think she was what you might call rich. She wished she were, for dear Miss Matty's sake. Then she stated her intention to write down what she could give on a sealed paper, only wishing it was more. She told me, my dear Mary, that she truly did wish it was more. Now I saw why paper, pens, and ink had been provided. Every lady wrote down the sum she could give annually, signed the paper, and sealed it mysteriously. If their proposal was acceded to, my father was to be allowed to open the papers under a pledge of secrecy. If not, they were to be returned to their writers. When the ceremony had been gone through, I rose to depart, but each lady seemed to wish to have a private conference with me. Miss Pole kept me in the drawing-room to explain why, in Mrs. Jameson's absence, she had taken the lead in what she was pleased to call the movement. She also informed me that she had heard from good sources that Mrs. Jameson was coming home directly in a state of high displeasure against her sister-in-law. This sister-in-law was forthwith to leave her house and was, Miss Pole believed, to return to Edinburgh that very afternoon. Of course, this piece of intelligence could not be communicated in front of Mrs. Fitzadam. This was especially true as Miss Pole was inclined to think that Lady Glenmire's engagement to Mr. Hoggins could not possibly hold against the blaze of Mrs. Jameson's displeasure. A few hearty inquiries after Miss Matty's health concluded my interview with Miss Pole. On coming downstairs, I found Mrs. Forrester waiting for me at the entrance to the dining parlor. She drew me in, and when the door was shut, she tried 2 or 3 times to begin on some subject. It was so unapproachable, apparently, that I began to despair of our ever getting to a clear understanding. At last, out it came. The poor old lady trembled all the time as if it were a great crime she was exposing to daylight. She told me how very, very little she had to live upon. This was a confession she was brought to make from a dread, a fear that we should think the small contribution named in her paper bore any proportion to her love and regard for Miss Matty. And yet that sum which she so eagerly relinquished was, in truth, more than a 20th part of what she had to live upon. With that small income, she had to keep a house and a little serving maid, all as became one who is born a Tyrrell. And when the whole income does not nearly amount to £100, to give up a 20th of it will necessitate many careful economies. It would require many pieces of self-denial, small and insignificant in the world's account, but bearing a different value in another account book that I have heard of. She said she wished so much that she was rich. She kept repeating this wish with no thought of herself in it, only with a longing, yearning desire to be able to heap up Miss Matty's measure of comforts. It was some time before I could console her enough to leave her. Then, on quitting the house, I was waylaid by Mrs. Fitzadam, who also had her confidence to make, though it was of a nearly opposite description. She had not liked to put down all that she could afford and was ready to give. She told me she thought she never could look Miss Matty in the face again if she presumed to be giving her as much as she should like to do. She recalled a time when she thought Miss Matty was such a fine young lady, while she herself was nothing but a country girl coming to market with eggs, butter, and similar things. For her father, though he was well-to-do, would always make her go on as her mother had done before her. She had to come into Cranford every Saturday and see after sales and prices and what-not. One day, she remembered, she met Miss Matty in the lane that leads to Comhurst. Miss Matty was walking on the footpath, which was raised a good way above the road. A gentleman rode beside her and was talking to her. She was looking down at some primroses she had gathered and was pulling them all to pieces. Mrs. Fitzadam believed she was crying. But after she had passed, Miss Matty turned round and ran after her. She asked, so kindly, about Mrs. Fitz, Adam's poor mother, who lay on her deathbed. When the young girl cried, Miss Matty took hold of her hand to comfort her, with the gentleman waiting for her all the time, and her own poor heart very full of something. Mrs. Fitzadam thought it was such an honor to be spoken to in that pretty way by the rector's daughter, who visited at Arley Hall. She had loved her ever since, she said, though perhaps she had no right to do it. But she asked if I could think of any way in which she might be allowed to give a little more without anyone knowing it. She would be so much obliged, and her brother, she added, would be delighted to doctor Miss Matty for nothing, providing medicines, leeches, and all. She confided in me her surprise that she should ever have come to be a sister-in-law to a ladyship. They all, she insisted, would do anything for her. I told her I was quite sure of it, and promised all sorts of things in my anxiety to get home to Miss Matty. She might well be wondering what had become of me, absent from her for 2 hours without being able to account for it. She had taken very little note of time, however. She had been occupied in numberless little arrangements preparatory to the great step of giving up her house. It was evidently a relief to her to be doing something in the way of retrenchment. As she explained, whenever she paused to think, the recollection of the poor fellow with his bad £5 note came over her, and she felt quite dishonest. Only, if it made her so uncomfortable, what must it not be doing to the directors of the bank, who must know so much more of the misery that would follow this failure? She almost made me angry by dividing her sympathy between these directors, whom she imagined were overwhelmed by self-reproach for the mismanagement of other people's affairs, and those who were suffering like her. Indeed, of the two, she seemed to think poverty a lighter burden than self-reproach, but I privately doubted if the directors would agree with her. Old hoards were taken out and examined as to their money value. Luckily, the value was small, or else I do not know how Miss Matty would have prevailed upon herself to part with such things as her mother's wedding ring, or the strange, uncouth brooch with which her father had disfigured his shirt frill, and other such things. However, we arranged things a little in order as to their financial estimation, and were all ready for my father when he came the next morning.